Keynote presenter is Dr. Andrew Katelaris. Andrew graduated from Sydney University with a Bachelor of Medicine in 1982 and was awarded a doctorate in medicine in immunopathology in 1992. He is the first medically trained practitioner in Australia to publicise the benefits of cannabis medicine, and he obtained the first industrial hemp licence in Australia in 1997. He's also pioneered the use of CBD oil in childhood epilepsy, and his alternative methods led to conflict with the medical board and was deregistered in 2005. What this guy has been through to actually help heal people and in the name of health and upholding the Hippocratic Oath and basically being a medical practitioner is absolutely unbelievable. After I booked in Andrew to present this year, he sent me a documentary YouTube link which I'll put on the Facebook page to share. And I was absolutely shocked at what this man has endured simply in the name of health. He's been jailed for months. He was jailed in a 5 by 3 metre cell with 2 other inmates for about 6 months. He was let out of the cell for 1 hour a day, sometimes not at all. He didn't have access to a proper library. He had problems mounting his legal defence, and all the charges against him he was found not guilty of, and in the name of health. So he really is a pioneer, and he really deserves everybody's support, because this paradigm of health is simply Orwellian speak for illness equals health, because what CBD oil can do and what it's going to take us through today is incredible. It's going to be a real eye-opener for all of us, including me. So please make welcome to the stage Dr. Andrew Katelaris.
Thank you, Anthony, for very kind words. Before I start, I would like to recognise the previous inhabitants of this ancient continent and strongly abrogate the doctrine of terra nullius that the British government used to denigrate their existence. Right? I also recognise that the Aboriginal people are being imprisoned in this country at a rate 20 times that of the general population, and the stolen generation is alive and well. As well as my activism in medical cannabis, we also work with dispossessed children who are being seized at a rate which is a global high from loving parents often, while some are seized for genuine reasons. In all the cases that I've seen, they've been taken for the financial gain of family and community services and this pseudo foster care industry that they're running. Yep. Okay. Anthony's covered the basic background of who I am and what I do. It's very hard to explain how you end up where you are. I describe myself as a medical scientist, but that doesn't mean I'm not open to a whole range of unusual and paranormal experiences. In fact, my life has been nothing but a whole range of unusual and paranormal experiences. Right? I'm often asked how I became involved with cannabis at all, the industrial and the medical uses of cannabis. And whilst I feel very comfortable talking about how I became involved to this group, I'd be much more circumspect to a group of, say, medical professionals, or I'd end up with a community treatment order and an injection of Largactil in my bum, right? At the age of 14, after school, one day I was living in the western suburbs of Sydney. I won't say I heard a voice, because there wasn't a voice. It was a non-verbal voice in my head telling me to go to Maryland's West Produce store and buy some hemp seed. Now, firstly, I didn't know what hemp seed was, right? And so I ignored it. I said, I don't know. But it kept going with what I call a stern authority. And in no time at all, I found myself sitting on a bus to Maryland's West Produce store, wondering what I was doing and what would happen when I got there and what this was all about. I got there. At that stage, the full prohibition has not in place, and you could buy hemp seed, as I learnt later, as a bird seed, right? So I bought a pound of bird seed and then went home, right, and basically awaited instructions. right? If you think we're independent beings, you've got a lot to learn, right? Once the chattering in your head stops and you can become receptive to a better reality coming into your head, you start to become a servant of progress, and that's what I'd like to be. This same voice told me to put these seeds between sheets of wet newspaper, and again I said, what am I doing? I didn't know at the time that all the birdseed had been steam sterilised, and most of them didn't actually germinate. 2 of them did germinate. One of them failed to transplant, but the plant that did transplant, I went down on my push bike to Yennora industrial area and found a nice damp little corner and planted it. And every few days after school I'd cycle down to Yennora and look at this plant, and to put it bluntly, I actually fell in love with it. Right? At 6 weeks, in what was going to be, unfortunately, a sign of the times, it was ripped off. I don't know by who or by what, but its action had been implanted in my mind. Now, I've described myself as a medical scientist. That doesn't mean I'm a skeptic. For instance, soon after this, I won't say I developed the ability to astrally project, but I found myself lying in bed, and for want of a better term, an astral body actually rose up away from my corporeal body and hovered for a few moments above me. I thought, what the fuck? I mean, I'm open-minded, but you know, it was quite interesting. The next night I couldn't wait to get to bed to see if it would happen again, and it did. And this time I got as far as the ceiling and hovered for a little longer. And on the 3rd night, I actually left the house and was looking down at this little fibre house that we were living at Guildford at the time. The difference between maybe Joe Average and a medical scientist is that next day I went and got a ladder and climbed up on the roof and had a look around. I said, yeah, I was really here, right? Unfortunately, the story has a sad ending, because very soon after that I engaged in binge drinking, and that appeared to have killed off the ability to psychically project like that. And it was only recovered decades later when I started experimenting with ketamine and other psychedelic drugs. All right. I was very excited when Anthony invited me, because the very name of paradigm shift resonated with me. If there's one thing I'll ask the question, do we need a paradigm shift? Remember the old saying, if it's not broken, don't fix it? So let's think, do we really need a paradigm shift? Are the paradigms that we have working? Right? So I'm going to go through, are the paradigms that we're labouring under at the moment working? All right, and I'm going to look at a number of different subheadings. Resources and the environment. Now this I saw as graffiti on a wall back in Glebe, I think in about 1970 something. A society that's based on private ownership and profit motive is not a society at all, but a state of conflict. And that's very true. Now, I don't want to offend anyone, but I've done a lot of academic research into the role of the Judeo-Christian religion for exploitation of the environment. And if you look at this Judeo-Christian religion, it gives to man the right to name and exploit all plants and animals on this planet, right? I am very aware that we share 80% of our DNA with a fruit fly. We share 98% of our DNA with a chimpanzee. We're nothing special, right? Without an opposable thumb and the ability to pick up a club and kill something, that's the only thing that set us apart from those, and it's not a very salubrious way to evolve. The technology that has been developed around us is what sets us aside, but we share a commonality with biology. Remember, 80% homology with a fruit fly. So don't get your heads too swollen. Okay, we're part of a web of life. Right? Whether we do or don't have a soul, or what is or what isn't a soul, I don't know. Right? I'm very aware that you can have your physical body confined in one place and a mental or astral or some other awareness or consciousness somewhere else. So there's no doubt there's a superimposition of different types of bodies, but I'm always cautious to say more than what I know, right? But as a direct experience that has occurred, and I can't ignore it. There's a book written by Ryan Eisler, an American sociologist, called The Chalice and the Blade. And in that, she looks through the lens of archaeology of how things have changed. How did we end up with what I call a Judeo-Christian nightmare that doesn't see the earth as a precious garden to be carefully looked after, but just a mine and a forest to be exploited ruthlessly, right? If you look at deep archaeology, most of the current crop of archaeology only goes back to about 3000 BC, right? And it tells the same story, whichever society we're in, whether it's the Egyptians or the Greeks. It's a male-orientated society that is imbued in warfare. If you look at the sculptures, what have you got? These big He-Man with an axe or a knife or a sword or a spear killing his brother man, right? The history is the history of conquest and subjugation and enslavement. But a few pioneering archaeologists dug a little bit deeper, and they went down to about 4000 BC, even though the current paradigm, the current financial masters weren't funding them. They persisted and they uncovered an entirely different reality. The last vestiges of this reality appeared in Crete. And when you look at the murals, rather than have these battle scenes and people trampling on with horses over broken bodies, you see a very different interpretation of how life was. The first thing, and the very clear thing, is all the iconography, and this is related to cannabis, I haven't sort of completely lost the track. All the iconography clearly established a female deity. At first, these were dismissed as mere fertility symbols, right? But when you looked a bit deeper, and some of these are reproduced, and you can do your own research on this, you see a form of artwork that is so different than what came after it. Beautiful scenes of verdant gardens, of male and female entwined in love, caring for animals, right? As you go deeper and looking at some of the very old cities, I think in Turkey and across what Ryan Eisler referred to as old Europe, the norm was to have an equal society. And Ryan described, from a sociological point of view, there's only actually two forms of societies that humans can engage in. It's either a dominator or an exploitative society or a cooperative society. It's very simple. People talk about a matriarchal society that was involved in prehistory, but that's not the way Eisler interpreted it. She interpreted it as a cooperative society, right? And that's really important. I mean, a matriarchal society is just the other side of a coin of a patriarchal society, one group afflicting the other. It's a bit like the difference between communism and capitalism. They say, oh, in communism, one group of people are exploiting another, but capitalism, that's just the opposite. You get that? Okay. Also, it was very clear, and I've seen reproductions of these murals, where the women were the principal religious main people. And it's a classic one that I can picture in my mind of three women drawn in the mural as big bodies and doing the holy blessing to everyone, and all the men sitting in a line sort of sucking it up, right? What happened? How did we get into this life-denying form that we're currently in? It appears that it occurred in a series of three major invasions between 4000 BC and 3000 BC. First in the north there were the Kurgans, then the Dorians, and then the Hebrew. So these people had evolved in a very different way to the original inhabitants of old Europe, right? They had adopted a war god. So rather than a god of love and the garden and the unity of all life, they developed a male war god. The Kurgans, and this is where it gets a little bit spooky, the Kurgans believed that their dagger was the source of their power, and they in fact put their dagger on the altar and worshipped it. And there's a very strong argument to be made for this. All this iconography concerning the crucifix is actually the Kurgan dagger, right? It's an ugly reality, and my life's work will be over when every organised religious building, every church is converted to a community centre or a shelter for the homeless. Then I know I can, all right. Now I will get back on topic, but I just had to get that out. Okay. Oh, Jesus. Okay, that's probably me. Right, I mean, IT is not my strong suit. I got a small icon and blew it up. It doesn't seem to project. But you get the idea. This is the current forestry policy. And I saw a little cartoon. The only thing that wasn't funny, there was a big logger standing on a stump of a tree with a chainsaw. He says, of course we're going to leave some of the trees for future generations. We're going to leave the bottom bits. And that's basically what it is. Trees and other plants are essential for our life. We have co-evolved. They've oxygenated the planet and allowed animal life to exist. Has anyone heard of Jared Diamond in his book on collapse? He's looked at 6 different societies over time and looked at the commonality of how they came to collapse. And the stories are the same. You chop down the trees, the land dries out, you have a prolonged drought, and everyone starves, right? It's happened 6 times, and it's a book worth reading, although you people don't probably need to read it, but God, everyone in Macquarie Street in Canberra need to read it, because if you don't learn from the lessons of history, you repeat them. Okay, so that's our forestry policy at the current time. Okay, gee, this is really sad. This is a beach in Indonesia. You'll just have to take my word for it. That's a mass of rotting plastic. Now, everyone has seen the sad pictures of pelicans and turtles either entrapped in plastic nets or choking on plastic garbage. The problem is much worse than that. You've all heard of the Pacific Gyre, the Central Pacific Gyre. If you haven't, it's a 700-kilometre conglomeration of rotting plastic that exists about 1 metre below the sea level to a depth of about 3 metres, right? Plastics don't have to be made with phthalates, but they are for the convenience of the manufacturers. Phthalates are a group of chemicals called xenoestrogens. So it's like we're disrupting the endocrine system of the whole planet. At some beaches in Hawaii, when they analyse the sand on those beaches, because that's sort of central to the gyre, 40% of the sand is made up of microplastics. Really concerned, the United States Red Cross did an analysis of infant cord blood, newborn's cord blood, the umbilical cord blood. They found an average of 160 industrial chemicals in the blood of newborns. And it didn't matter if you were in the city or the country, 160 industrial chemicals. Every baby they tested had detectable levels of DDT, even though it was banned 30 years previously. Every baby had detectable levels of Teflon, and it goes on and on. It's a tragedy in the making. All right, Fukushima was mentioned a bit earlier. This is, again, I apologise for the lack of resolution, but I'm sure you can understand what's happening here. Everyone is aware of Chernobyl, and it's constantly brought up as an issue about nuclear radiation and the dangers of that. Fukushima dwarfs Chernobyl by many orders of magnitude, and I'll just spend a few moments on that. And again, I'm not off topic because you can't fix one part of this world without fixing all of it, right? The issue of human manipulation of nuclear energy, as has been explained to me by some people, is one of the reasons why we may have actually attracted the attention of interdimensional beings. Because whilst we were just chopping down trees and killing each other, okay, the little monkeys are just making a little mess, but once you start mucking around with nuclear energy, you make a much bigger mess, and the implications of your actions are not only tragic initially, but they go on for hundreds of thousands of years. and I don't think I can understate that. Are people aware what actually happened? And I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this subject, just so you understand. The Fukushima Daiichi reactors were built by General Electric in 1958. At that stage, the cliff was 30 metres high. But to facilitate construction of these power plants, they bulldozed 20 metres off the top of the cliff and built the reactors a mere 10 metres above the sea level in an area known to have seismic activity on a regular basis and tsunamis. They then put the diesel generators in the basement. You got that? They put the spent fuel rod, which is the size of a large Olympic pool, 4 stories above. Right? When the tsunami came, the electricity grid failed, the diesel generators were swamped, and what we're experiencing there are 3 nuclear meltdowns. There's never been a meltdown in human history before. This is the China syndrome. You know, we have, firstly, in a nuclear reactor, there's 6 inches of stainless steel or more, and then feet of concrete. They've already burnt through that, and they're bubbling in the ground. Do you know what TEPCO, the company responsible for this mess, you know what their plan was? To dig a kilometre-long trench and put freezing columns in it and try and freeze the groundwater so the radiation doesn't get away. It's delusional, but what they've managed to do is throw a cone of silence over the whole thing. So no one talks about it, there's no reports about it, and this disaster is going on. We may be looking at an extinction event in the Pacific Ocean, certainly within our lifetimes. They're meant to only store 1 year's worth of spent fuel rods in this swimming pool. It turns out now they've admitted that there was 10 years supply of fuel rods. There's 1,200 rods in there, and a fuel rod is about sort of so big and something like 2 metres long, and they're packed closely together a bit like cigarettes in a packet. The problem is, with all the disruption and the explosion, everything's twisted and it's very hard to pick things out. The last time I read about it, they've managed to remove 4 out of the 12. Right? 1,200. 4 out of the 1,200. So we're looking at a really serious problem. Now this is a problem, I don't know what the solution is, but what I do know, the solution is not to ignore what's happening. Right? It's a tragedy, and the only way forward that I can see is for all nuclear capable nations to have an urgent meeting and come up with some sort of plan. But at this stage, that's their current energy process, make an almighty mess and then pretend it's not happening. There's the only nuclear reactor we need, right? You're all aware of that, I hope. And it's situated at a safe distance from Earth, and it provides us with an abundance of energy. All right, what's their media and politics paradigm at the moment? I call what we live in a pseudo-democracy. Right, yeah, we all get to vote, but what do we get? We get Tweedledee or Tweedledum. Basically, a rotating door of the same sort of clowns, and nothing really changes. Despite who's in the top seat at the moment, the deep state, and interpret that however you want, but that sort of ugly paradigm of corporate control runs forward like nothing has changed. You've all caught up with Cambridge Analytica, who've been mining data around the world so they can manipulate public opinion and cause an election result that they want. False flags. This is where it gets really serious. I'm sure you're all familiar with what a false flag is. The first major false flag that I became aware of was the Reichstag fire in Germany in 1933. Now, most people probably aren't aware. Hitler was elected to the Reichstag with 30% of the vote. The communists had 30% of the vote, and independents had 30% of the votes. You can't change the law in Germany under their old system unless you had 60% of the vote. So what they did, they burnt down the parliament. They blamed a demented Dutch communist as the cause of this fire, took over all the communist seats, and the rest is history, and the world progressed to a disaster with massive human and environmental costs. There's other false flags. The Gulf of Tonkin. The Vietnam War was started on the basis of a supposed attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on an American destroyer. 50 years after that event, 1964, 50 years after the event, they had to release all the information, and they accepted that there was never an attack. They just used it as an excuse. And here's the big daddy of them all. I think Anthony's already mentioned that. I'm a member of 9/11 Truth Movement, and I've looked with forensic detail into what goes on there. It's not only that the planes can't cause buildings to collapse, it's the fact that a 110-storey building fell at free fall speed because the Americans used a militarised version of thermite called thermate, which is only made at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, evidently, to actually cut the supports out of the building, and that's why they fell in such a spectacular way. Why isn't it that it can't be seen? There are many people calling it out, but the sheep, with their heads down, march on and accept the official version. This is a very serious state of affairs because it's been used to augment the destabilisation of the planet and the militarisation of the planet. Okay, what's their health and drug policy? Even within the period of my own professional life, I think I graduated 1982, but within that period I've seen an alarming increase in many serious diseases. Glioblastoma multiforme, a deadly brain cancer, was a relatively uncommon tumour when I was a student. In my last professional job at North Shore Private Hospital, we were seeing 5 or 6 a week. Right? Further than that, the survival of these tumours under current therapy of cut, burn and poison hasn't changed in that period of time. The average survival after diagnosis is 18 months. Autoimmune diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, right? Autism, evidently in the 50s there was no autism wards. Autism was a very, very rare condition. We can't say the same today, right? And neurodegenerative diseases, they confidently predict, oh, by such and such a year, this many people will have Alzheimer's disease. They'll have it because they've engineered it that way, it seems, or the lifestyle that people have been forced into have resulted in that sort of, and I'll talk in a bit more detail about that. Medical dogma is bolstered by pseudo-experts. I'm only going to discuss 2, and I could talk into next week about medical dogma and pseudo-experts, but let's just talk about 2. I'll start with fluoride. Fluoride is the nearest we have come to a universal poison. As far as I'm aware, as far as I'm aware, there is not a single enzyme system in the human body that's not adversely affected by fluoride. Its ramifications are massive. Right? Currently, thyroxine, or artificial thyroid hormone, is the largest selling medication in the world because we now have an epidemic of Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Right? Hypofunctioning of the thyroid gland, because the iodine, which is so essential in what I'll call the old days, when cows were sort of milked in the old way, they used a lot of iodine on the teats as an antiseptic, and people got copious amounts of iodine. Right now they put a tiny bit of iodine, a tiny amount of iodine in the salt, and then tell you not to eat salt because it's bad for your blood pressure. It's not fully rational, right? But fluoride has many, many more effects than that. Let me give you an example. Here are the people that you trust for your health advice, right? I couldn't find the one I really wanted to show. That was the famous Kent microlight filter. You know what it was? Asbestos. So not only were you smoking a cigarette, but you were sucking it through an asbestos filter, right? Trust him, he's a doctor, right? Okay. For a better starting life, start cola earlier, right? Let's not delay, right? I mean, have you all heard of maturity onset diabetes? You know what they've got now? Maturity onset diabetes of the young, right? It's a nightmare, right? How soon is too soon? I'll tell you what, the first 100 years of life is too soon. All right, that's that. Another good one, mother and baby picked up with a crate of Black's beer. Right? This is from the 40s and 50s, right? Nightmare. But things things haven't changed, they've just become more subtle, right? So we haven't changed. I'm just dragging these out just to show what the background is. Okay, it's likely across the Western nations that the health system is going to collapse under the weight of obesity and the metabolic syndrome that's associated with it. Now, it's very easy to blame overweight people for being overweight, but I see it more as a form of metabolic poisoning. High fructose corn syrup and and we've already mentioned the thyroid hypofunction. High fructose corn syrup is a metabolic poison, right? They're now, thank God, talking about separating out the sugar analysis in the labels to distinguish natural fruit sugars, say, from artificially added high fructose corn syrup. But it's a bit like too little, too late. Okay, Fluvax. Right? I'm not making this stuff up. Here it is in black and white. I'll read it in case it's not clear. The indication is based on immune response elicited by the Fluvax. There's been no controlled trials adequately demonstrating a decrease in influenza disease after vaccination. Have you got that? This is on the PI, the product information. Right? I describe the health system as a fox minding the pigeons at this stage. Now, we're all aware that they've added mercury to many of the immunisations. Right? Mercury is up there with fluoride, not quite as universally toxic, but it's up there with fluoride. And the reason why they add mercury at all, it's called an adjuvant. And an adjuvant is a bit like a whip to the immune system, so it stimulates the immune system. That's why they add the mercury. Now, if you can demonstrate a certain rise in titer of an antibody, and an antibody is a particular protein that's made by the immune system to counter infectious diseases, if you can demonstrate a rise in the antibody, that means you can say your product is effective. It may be, if you formulated the antigen, the thing that's stimulating the immune system, incorrectly, right? You can have a rise in IgG or immunoglobulin, but you don't get protection because the antibody is not active against the actual pathogen. And that's the reason for this failure. Right? Also, how do you catch influenza? You don't catch it by a needle under the skin, you breathe it in. More advanced techniques of immunisation. Remember, I'm trained as an immunopathologist, and I'm not against the idea of immunisation. Right? The idea of immunisation is a very good idea, but it has to, as closely as possible, mimic natural immunisation to be as effective as you want. Right? Jamming a bit of flu virus wall under the skin of a child or an adult is going to stimulate an IgG response, but it won't lead to protection. It's much more important if you use, for instance, a nasal inhalation where you develop surface mucosal antibodies, and then you'll have an impact on the disease itself. Rather, why not just get very healthy and naturally resist it? If you have enough ascorbic acid and antioxidants in your diet, you might have influenza that'll be an 8-hour sort of, oh, I don't feel 100%, and then you're back to normal, right? There's been a lot of talk of intravenous vitamin C in the treatment of cancer. I haven't found it very useful, but I've found it very, very useful to treat serious viral illnesses, I'll tell you that, and without any significant side effects. But that's the current state of medical science. The fox is minding the pigeons. Okay, have any of you seen this before? This is Dr. Declan's cancer maps. The data to make these maps was derived from the British Cancer Registry. What he merely did was highlight in a colour scale here, the lowest incidence and the highest incidence of these three cancers. There's two more different cancers, but three on the side, the prostate, leukemia and pancreatic cancer. North Island is not fluoridated, Southern Ireland is fluoridated. There's a 20 to 25% increase in cancer in Southern Ireland. And remember, the Irish are genetically homogeneous, right? So here we have a real world experiment that puts pay to the fact that fluoride is a safe medicine, right? The data on fluoridation is atrocious. Most people may not be aware, fluoridation started, as far as I'm informed, during the Second World War. The Americans in their war effort were smelting a lot of aluminium, and Alcoa ended up wherever the fallout from their chimneys were, there was death. It's a total biocide. The insects, the plants, the animals died. So downwind of these factories, there was just carnage. Right? So that wasn't, people were getting upset, their farm suddenly was a wasteland. They started suing the government. So the government started scrubbing the fluoride out of the towers. But then you ended up with it in tanks. And it's one of the most corrosive chemicals, fluorosilicic acid is one of the most corrosive chemicals known to man, and it can't stay in the drums very long before they start to leak. So some genius got the idea of putting it into the drinking water. Right? It's, the more you know, mate, it becomes a nightmare, right? But it certainly is a call to arms. Now, there is a slight amount of evidence that giving fluoride to children between the ages of 8 and 14 in a very small manner reduces the amount of dental caries. No more than proper dental hygiene and even topical application, but the evidence for its use as a universal medication is zero. Right? For instance, why would an 80-year-old with no teeth want to be taking fluoride? Why would a labourer who's working in hot sun and having to drink 3 or 4 litres a day have multiples of a normal dose? It is just an affront to human intelligence that they're mass medicating the population with what is a sedative drug, right? Worse than that, we talked about the pineal gland. I've done hundreds of forensic post-mortems. It's very hard to find a pineal gland, I'll tell you that. They're not only calcified, they're just obliterated, right? It's a worry. I'm not a worrying type, but I'm concerned about where this planet is going. Okay, cannabis prohibition. This is part of the paradigm shift. I think by this stage, we'll all agree with each other that a paradigm shift is not only required, but it's required as a matter of urgency. All right? Now, everyone bandies around the idea of a revolution, but when you look at the geometry of it, a revolution, you go round, and just like Animal Farm, you end up where you started. We don't need a revolution. What we need is an about face. Almost everything that's currently being done has to be undone. So we have to move to 180 degrees and go in the other direction, right? Wrong way, go back. Now, the cannabis prohibition was... I'm not a historian. I know at some stage in Egypt there was a minor prohibition of cannabis because a group of the Egyptians in the lower classes who were cannabis users refused to pay taxes or do some sort of action against the government. So they made the cannabis illegal so they could go and crack heads and things like that. But the global prohibition of cannabis started in 1937. Misinformation, fear-mongering and racism was used by the Randolph Hearst Press. Right, now, it's very clear, and I spent quite a bit of time in the 90s researching and making a documentary called $1 Billion Crop, which is a history of the prohibition and looking at the political basis of it. Right, and I'll be talking about that next. The prohibition was used to transit from a natural carbohydrate-based world economy to the present hydrocarbon-based system. So the first artificial fabric that was made was nylon. Right? Nylon was made by the DuPont Corporation. Andrew Mellon, who ran a major government part and had interest in a private bank, funded DuPont, and he actually appointed Harry Anslinger to start the prohibition. And they basically made a racist attack on Mexicans and musicians and Negroes as the cause of all the problems in the United States at that time. Okay, here's some cannabis. I'll just take a little break from all that negativity and focus on what's good about cannabis. I'll give you a little bit of agronomic data first. This was one of the crops I grew down in Victoria. Now, again, I apologise for the lack of resolution, but here you see a crop that's still in its vegetative state, and here is a crop that's well advanced in terms of flowering. Right? Cannabis is a fairly complex and unique crop. Its flowering time is determined by the lengthening night in August. So as a regular routine, you plant cannabis in the spring. Obviously this doesn't apply to indoor growing, where we can manipulate the growth cycle simply by changing the time of light, right? But depending on the genetic origin of the plant, where it originated from, that determines when it flowers. The purpose of this experiment was that I took some seeds that we'd bred up at Gunnedah and then moved them down to Victoria. Now remember, the further away you get from the equator, the slower it takes for the days to shorten. Remember, at the equator, summer and winter are about 12 hours, and 12 hours is usually enough to trigger the cannabis to flower. But if you move an equatorial plant further down, say it's March, right, the day length is still relatively long, and so the plant doesn't flower. And we demonstrated 20 to 30% increase in biomass production by growing our seed equatorially and then bringing it down, right? That's quite an interesting observation, and it allows us to dramatically increase the per acre cultivation, yield of the cannabis. There's a few things about cannabis hemp, excuse me, that are important, and I'll just define my terms firstly. Cannabis is a botanical name that applies to all the varieties of cannabis. Some people say cannabis sativa, some say sativa and indica. I'm not going to debate those sort of terminologies, but hemp is a word usually used for the industrial strain of hemp. It now has a legal definition. In Australia, where one thing we've got right, the range of THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, in a hemp plant to be legally grown is 0.5%. In other jurisdictions it can be 0.3 or 0.2. But the difference between, to call a cannabis plant hemp, is a legal definition relating to having low levels of THC. It's an unnecessary action, and what it's done, it's actually retarded the agronomic research that we'd like to do, because it's a bit like trying to fight with one arm behind your back. What you want to do when you're breeding cannabis, and it's a beautiful thing to do to breed cannabis, you set the plants out and you select for the tray that you want, and then you just cross. If you want high biomass, you select the biggest plants. It's not rocket science, it's just basically plant husbandry, and it's very easy. But if a government has insisted your plants are always below 0.2 or 0.3 or even 0.5, that introduces another obstacle to actually producing the plants that you want. Because the sort of trays that we want to breed for are yield, resistance to insects, and other favourable agronomic trays. But even allowing for that, with a bit of help from people in Europe and things, we managed to create industrial varieties that can be grown under Australian conditions. The hemp plant is fascinating, right? Obviously, you see the aerial parts of the plant, the subterranean parts of the plant. Hemp has a very deep penetrating taproot. One of its major advantages is it can mobilise subsoil nutrients. It can also give it a great deal of drought resistance. Now, no plant can grow without water, but we did an involuntary trial up at Gunnedah. During a drought, we couldn't irrigate this particular crop, and the farmer had corn, sorghum and hemp in the paddock. And as the drought progressed, we lost the corn first, then we lost the sorghum, and it was 4 weeks later that we lost the hemp. Right? So no plant can grow without water, but it certainly sort of stood strong and tall for much longer than all the others. The density of the plant makes a huge difference as well. If you want to maximise your seed yield, you normally plant the crop about 1 metre apart to grow the classic Christmas tree shape of the plants. The problems with that is then becomes very difficult to harvest, because it mostly has to be done by hand. You've got to cut the tree and shake the seeds out, and it's not really amenable to machine harvesting. Further than that, what's been found around the world, and certainly in our own research, if you constrict the plant to a variable density, it could be 15 centimetres, 20, just depending on what you're doing and what your end product is, at about 4 to 6 weeks, you get what we call canopy closure. That means all the bottom leaves, these big fan leaves, interlock with each other, and then as the plant grows, right, you end up with a beautiful self-mulching situation that retains the water, smothers out the weeds, right? You can actually walk down a tunnel of cannabis plants, and the bees, mate, bees are unbelievable in a hemp crop. It sounds like a aeroplane taking off with just the buzz of the bees when the pollen's shedding. Now, okay, why did things go bad for hemp? And remember, the first law in the United States that was made concerning cannabis was in 1643. In 1643, they passed a law in Virginia saying you must grow at least 10% of your farm to hemp, and you could use it to pay your taxes. Right, so things have changed quite a bit. At that stage, hemp was critically needed for wind-powered sailing ships because the sail and the rigging had to withstand the saltwater environment. Things like flax and the other natural fibres simply didn't have the longevity for that. So hemp was essential to empire. There was no doubt about that. And as I said, the first law that was made in the United States made it compulsory to grow cannabis, and that's a law we want to see reinstated. This led to the demise of the cannabis industry. This is the Schlichten decorticator. The Schlichten decorticator, now a little bit of background, the stalk of hemp has two different types of fibre. The outside is called the bast, the B-A-S-T, the bast fibre, and that's the one that's used for textiles or for archival paper. The inner, which comprises about 70% of the biomass, is hurd, H-U-R-D, and that's almost pure cellulose. That can be used for a whole range of different things. But to fully exploit the economic potential of the hemp plant, you've got to separate the bast from the hurd. Now, up until the discovery or the creation of the Schlichten decorticator, that work was done by Negro slaves, basically. And to do that, you got the hemp stalk in a brake, they called it a hemp brake, and it was basically a great lump of heavy wood and two panels down here. And all day you'd have to crack into this hemp. It's back-breaking work, right? It could only be viable, really, with slave labour. There were other ways of doing it. You could ret the hemp. And certainly in the European jurisdictions, they retted the hemp by placing it into ponds so that the long fibre and the short fibre could be easily separated. But the Schlichten decorticator was going to allow for a massive expansion of the hemp industries. The hemp industries were already in significant decline because sailing ships were being replaced by steam power, so they didn't need the vast volumes of fibre that the hemp plant had. Now here, this is a Popular Mechanics magazine. It was published in 1937, the new billion-dollar crop. It was a plea by the writers of Popular Mechanic to not ban cannabis. They said that if we properly exploit this, now that we have a decorticator, it can become the new billion-dollar crop. Bearing in mind, $1 billion in 1937, it's literally like saying $1 trillion crop. You'll see that they claimed that there were 20,000 different items of commerce that could be made from different parts of the hemp plant. Paper, fabric of all sorts, geotextiles. But the Reefer Madness campaign took over. And that's, as I said before, they used racist, scaremongering tactics. I mean, what has cannabis got to do with hypodermic needles? Right? That's one drug that you simply don't inject. Weird orgies, wild parties, unleashed passions. Boy, I thought I grew good pot, but I never had any of those, so... Look at this. They always put a religious weed with its roots in hell, right? There you go. Reefer Madness. A moment of ecstasy, an eternity of hell. Right? This is the sort of shit they came up with. Has anyone seen Reefer Madness? It's an obscene parody of the facts, but that's what we had to deal with. And there's an old saying that I've found to be very true. It's a lot easier to fool people than convince them they've been fooled. Right? And once this propaganda has settled into what few neurons people call their brain, it's very hard to actually dislodge that sort of feeling. Okay, we've already heard from Nate, I think. There was a little corner of the Henry Ford car. This is a Henry Ford car built in 1941, and although it's probably not obvious, hang on, this man has a sledgehammer, and he is bashing the back of that car which has 10 times the impact resistance of steel at 1/6 of its weight. So this simple technology was available in 1941. Now just reflect briefly on how the world would be a different and better place if we'd utilised cellulose plastics for structural use such as automobiles. Right? The implications are enormous. Right? We don't need so much iron ore, we don't need so much coal. Right? These things are basically indestructible. The only way to, when you want to recycle them, you've got to grind them up. And you can use them as a fertiliser in your garden or a soil conditioner. So that's a reality. It's really interesting. When we were making the documentary $1 Billion Crop, we went to the Library of Congress because some activists in the United States, Jack Herrera especially, had been in contact. And like, it's really easy now, we all got our little devices now, but back when we were doing this activism, you had a rotary dial modem that you fitted to your ordinary analogue telephone to make contact with people and things like that, so it wasn't easy to be connected. But we got this scratchy message through, Andrew, you've got to get onto this, you've got to look for this particular newsreel. So we went with our film crew to the Library of Congress and we knew what the number was. You know how they have a catalogue number? Let's say it was number 8, for instance. There was our film crew. They went 6, 7, 9. What? I said, we know it's there because we had a copy. The activists had got a copy from somewhere else that hadn't been destroyed. But what they did, in a very Orwellian sense, is tried to delete that thing. There was a documentary called Hemp for Victory, made in the early 1940s. Now, at that stage, nylon was in its very early stages, and with the demands of the war industries in the United States, nylon was found simply, firstly, they didn't have the productive capacity, but it wasn't up to the standard of hemp to make range of military equipment, parachute harnesses, fire hoses, all sorts of things required it. So they stopped the prohibition in 1941. Right? Now, this is really interesting because they'd already banned it, remember, in 1937, and the government put out a request, does anyone have any hemp seed? Right? And this man, Gavin McMurtry, he was sort of a colourful old fellow, he's probably deceased now, but good on him, he put up his hand and said, look, and he talks in a funny way, he says, I thought the prohibition was phooey, so I put in 100 acres, right, of hemp seed, of seed hemp I should say. Within 2 days, the US government had that hemp farm ringed by armoured personnel carriers because it suddenly became a critical resource for their war effort. And over the next 3 years, they expanded that 100 acres to 240,000 acres. Right, the Hemp for Victory program, it's available on YouTube. I'm not making this stuff up. But in 1945, as soon as the war was over, the prohibition was reapplied. So it's truly said that in the war on drugs, the first casualty is truth. That certainly applies to the medical applications, which I will get to fairly soon. This is Hempcrete. Hempcrete is a form of cellulose cement, and it's made by mixing the chipped inner fibre of the hemp. So you can take the hemp stalks, put them through your decorticator, use the high-value bast fibre that can be grown without chemicals, unlike cotton, and make the best quality linens. You can make the best quality archival paper. And the hurd, which is left, you can mix it with various binders. This is something I actually built in my backyard, and I'm no builder. This is the first thing I've ever actually built. Building with hempcrete is like plasticine. Right? I say I can train a bright person to do this in 5 minutes and a dull person in about 10 minutes. It's that easy. Right? Seriously, mate, and it's a buzz, right? Because unlike other building, it's a monocote, right? You've got the floor, the walls, and then the ceiling are all in continuity. What we do, we change the ratio of the binder to the hurd depending on what you want. If you want high density, high strength for the foundations, you use much more binder and less hurd. But as you get towards the top bit, and remember this was only originally set up, we just wanted to, we ran a few building courses to publicise it, and it was only later that I decided, well, I'm not going to pull that down, and I ended up just sort of cobbling it up together. It is brilliant. right? It breathes. Now, it's hard to define what it means to say a building breathes, but this one breathes, right? People just feel comfortable in a hempcrete building. More important than that, unlike most modern building materials, including the place where we are now, there are no VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, which are largely responsible for the sick building syndrome. Right? So the advantage of hemp, I'm already talking about the medical uses of cannabis, even though it may not appear to be, because if you're living in an unhealthy building, you will get respiratory disorder. You may get autoimmune disease from the volatile organic compounds. So we can't cure our health without curing the planet, because as I said at the beginning of this talk, we're one and the same thing. We're products of the soil. Okay. All right, now we're on to the medicine. This was my first little grow. As you can see here, they're grown under lights, and the reason why we put them under lights is because you can manipulate the flowering, you can force flowering and have 3 or 4 crops in a year instead of 1 or 2 crops. And most of the medical growing in the experimental phase was done under lights, although my preferred option is outdoor organic. But if you're faced with the threat of helicopters and ordinary thieves, we're basically forced indoors under lights. 3 different varieties, what we call cultivars, or cultivated varieties. Now remember, when I started this was back in the 90s, I mean, I won't say I didn't know what I was doing, but let me say I was on a very steep learning curve, right? Because there was no one to teach you. You had to come through all this yourself. Here was my little laboratory where we do the cloning. So you'd basically have a mother plant. After you'd done the original growing, you'd select the cultivar or the cultivated variety that you wanted, and then you'd keep it under permanent vegetation. So you wouldn't reduce the light, you'd keep it at 18 hours of light and just keep chopping it and cloning it, right? Just simple, it's simple stuff, right? Cloning. And that way you had a genetically homogeneous and reproducible medical quality. And what we found very early in the piece was that different cultivars had significantly different effects. So when the government comes up with some nonsense like, oh, you know, cannabis doesn't have an analgesic effect, that may be true. It depends on the cannabinoid profile. Now, cannabinoids are a class of compounds. Now, you've all been outside where those nice doTERRA and other oils are. The thing that gives these plants their smell are terpenes, another particular group of chemicals. Cannabis, as far as we're aware, is the only plant that can take 2 terpenes and create a diterpene, which is then called a cannabinoid, right? Now, there's at least 100 different cannabinoids, although for practical purpose there's 7 of the main ones, and within those 7 there's 2 of the very main ones. That's THC and CBD, right? Don't worry about the particular details, but the ratio of the different cannabinoids has a profound impact on the effect that we'll have on people, both recreationally and therapeutically. For instance, because of the prohibition, most of the illegal growers, like the non-medical growers, would concentrate on maximising the THC content. And over time, the CBD, or the cannabidiol, was bred out of the recreational cannabis market. Now, a lot of people who experienced THC without the balance of the other cannabinoids experience a range of side effects. You can't pretend otherwise. They often experience paranoia, especially if they are naive to the drug. Certainly after heavy use, you'd have a short-term memory deficit, which would recover in 6 weeks, unlike the alcohol memory deficit, which goes on until you die, right? But once we'd done our initial empirical work, see, we didn't have access to analytical laboratories at that stage, so we used ourselves as little test animals to get an impression of, and after a while you could find, oh, you know, there was different, was this one rather more sedative? Was this rather more stimulating? I mean, now we can produce a fingerprint, and for instance, some of the more stimulating ones had a particular cannabinoid called THCV, or cannabidivarin, right? Things have moved along a lot recently, but you know, we have to go through these baby steps and learning curves. There's Mary. Mary was the first, not your typical stoner, right? She was, dear old Mary, she was the first person I treated for chronic pain and opiate addiction. Mary was a feisty, politically active, mentally aware individual that some idiot GP decided she should be on a cholesterol drug, one of the class of the statins. You're familiar with the statins? Probably one of the greatest cons that have been inflicted on humanity. I'll just take a couple of moments to talk about cholesterol. Right? Cholesterol is an essential component of the human body. Cholesterol takes part in the creation of cell membranes, of the gonads, of the brain. If you don't eat enough cholesterol, such is its importance, is that the body, the liver, synthesises cholesterol. These statins are drugs which poison the liver and stop it synthesising the cholesterol. The claim is based on the false assertion that the lower your level of cholesterol, the lower your risk of having cardiovascular disease or CVAs or any other form of atheromatous degeneration. The only problem with that is it's not true. Right? That's a real issue. And repeating a lie many times doesn't make it true. Right? It's just a lie that's repeated many times. Now, the statin hypothesis that the doctors are relying on, and this drug, the statins, has a massive global sales because they do what you call bracket creep, right? It used to be, cholesterol of 7 milligrams a decilitre, then it was 6, and then it was 5. So they do bracket creep, and that way they expand their market. And now the real radical ones are saying, let's put everyone on them. Let's put them in there with the fluoride. I mean, that's a ridiculous suggestion, but they're saying it. Right? The problem with statins, because it is basically a metabolic poison, it has severe side effects. And the side effect that, the side effects that Mary suffered from was what you call a myelitis. It affected her muscles. It operates through the mitochondria. And she ended up basically in a wheelchair with almost no muscular strength and constant aching, for which she was given synthetic narcotics like OxyContin, which is now responsible for more deaths than all illicit drugs combined. Bear that in mind. When I saw her, we had been associated, I suppose you'd say, through Civil Liberties Council and things like that. So I knew Mary, and when I got this distressed phone call, she said, they fucked me up, Andrew. She says, I can't get out of a chair, I'm not well. And I went and saw her, and she was married to a lovely man, Alex, who was also blind. Talk about getting all your bad luck at one time. Alex had a retinoblastoma when he was 1, and they cut out his eye, which is standard sort of treatment at that stage. But he had the 1 in 100,000 chance of what you call a sympathetic ophthalmoplegia. That means if you touch one eye, the other one gets attacked by the immune system. So he went completely blind. Anyway, I mean, I knew Mary, we had to help, but I was involved in a lot of other things at that stage, and I quickly knocked up a few cuttings and said, look, I can't come and grow them for you. There was a big shortage of good quality medical cannabis at that stage. I said, we'll have to rely on Alex, but Alex hadn't done much gardening, and I went away to Queensland. I was doing whatever I was doing there. And I mean, I gave her the cuttings in December during a heat wave, and I thought, God, I don't think this is going to go very well. Long story short, came back about 6 weeks later, and there was a damn jungle. I mean, talk about the power of love. Alex was so devoted, he just looked after these plants, and it was in Chatswood, and the house had no real fences, and there's just this forest of pot. But whatever things look after people doing the right thing, you know, the neighbours knew about it. They all loved Mary, so they weren't going to say anything. But yeah, I remember my pleasant surprise when I walked in. What? Yeah, these are 2.5 metres high, rising up over the paling fence. Anyway, we got away with that, and Mary did very, very well on that. Okay, why does medical cannabis have such a diverse range of beneficial effects? Right, the list of cannabis responsive conditions is incredibly long, and it's much easier to give a list of things that it doesn't have a positive effect for than to give a list of what it is. right? Conditions that seem completely unrelated. Inflammatory bowel disease, childhood epilepsy, neurodegenerative disorders, cancer. All these things appear to be positively impacted by cannabis. And the biochemical reason for it appears to be the endocannabinoid system. Don't get fussed by the terminology. Endo just means within your body. So just like we have intrinsic opioids, just pass on that one. There's an intrinsic opioid. No, it just won't come to me. But the endocannabinoid system is a system of messenger chemicals and receptors that regulate the whole body. Now, such is the centrality of the endocannabinoid system, every organism, going back to the sea squirt, has an endocannabinoid system. Right? It really is essential for the cooperation in any multicellular organism. The molecule, and we thank Professor Ralph Mechoulam for doing a lot of the initial chemistry on the endocannabinoid system. Now, having said that, whatever I say about the endocannabinoid system is provisional, and over the next decade or so, our knowledge hopefully will gain. So just accept what we're saying as the current state of knowledge, which is in a very primitive state. But we know enough to make the following assertions. Firstly, it was thought that the endocannabinoids only existed in the brain, and that's why it had a psychotropic effect. But now we know that they're densely populated in the immune system and in the gut. And there's increasing acceptance of the role of the microbiome in general health and the functioning of the immune system. Right? It does seem a little counterintuitive, but in many ways, I mean, it's like fuel in your car. You put the wrong fuel in your car, it's not going to run. The gut is important. It has some unique features compared with other biological systems. Now, we've already seen an example of a cell membrane. I'm just showing this to highlight a few different aspects of what a cell membrane is. And bear in mind that this is a gross simplification of what actually happens in real life. It's easy to look at diagrams and think that's what it is, but the body, like these are the receptors that it was spoken about earlier. There's both receptors that, he referred to them as antenna, I prefer to talk them as receptors. They can be receptors for immunoglobulins, they can be receptors for all sorts of things, and then there's the transmembrane channels. The important thing I wanted to show you here though is what we call the lipid bilayer, right? There is two different sorts of chemicals. There's ones that are called hydrophobic or hydrophilic. Simply means one likes to be in water, one doesn't like to be in water. You just mix oil with water and what happens? They don't mix, they don't dissolve, they form a bilayer. The oil floats, right? Here what we've got in this lipid bilayer, we have the hydrophilic, the ones that love the water, and the ones on the inside, the hydrophobic ones. So when you mix them together, they orientate themselves. The ones that don't want water turn to each other, right? And you create a cell membrane. Now, the important thing why are people's endocannabinoid system failing? Right, we know why people's endocrine system is failing, because they're not getting enough fluoride, because they have a huge amount of unquenched oxidative stress which damages the thyroid gland, and then you make antibodies, self-antibodies. Right? It's not rocket science. Say for instance, you expose to the immune system tissue and organs that don't normally get exposed to the immune system, what happens? It develops a reaction to those because it thinks they're foreign, it hasn't seen them before, and you end up with anti-thyroid antibodies, right? Which then perpetuates the destruction of the gland. That's why thyroxine is the biggest selling drug in this country, and the world for that matter, right? They appear to have engineered this. I can't say it's accidental. These people aren't stupid, they're malicious and malignant, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting, and I mean, we're at a paradigm shift conference, and you know, basic science is one thing, but the more you learn, the more wonderful and mysterious it gets. Okay, why I love hemp seed. I spent 6 years negotiating with FSANZ. FSANZ is Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. They're a bunch of sellout pseudoscientists that regulate what you can. Oh, it's not a joke, mate. You spent 6 years of your life talking to these cretins, right? It's not. It gets worse. It gets worse though, right? It only took me 18 months, to be honest, to win over FSANZ. But then you have a thing called the FOFR, F-O-F-R, what is it called? The Federal Organisation for Food. It's basically the health ministers of all the states, and the Prime Minister determines what you can and can't eat. Right? So FSANZ gives it a tick, and it took us 18 months. Normally it takes just a few months. They look at your science, they look at the safety, it's generally recognised as safe, and it goes through. But then the health ministers would not sign off on this. 5 minutes, okay. And it took fully 6 years until we actually got them to sign off. Why did I spend 6 years of my life so that people could enjoy and benefit from hemp seed? It's because in this membrane, right, the anandamide, and I haven't mentioned that, the intrinsic endocannabinoid, the cannabinoid that your body makes itself, Ralph McChullum christened it anandamide, which is evidently a Sanskrit word meaning bliss, right? Because his attitude was once everything was humming along, it was bliss. I mean, it sounds a lot better to call it an anandamide than a racodonyl ethanolamide, right? So I'll go with anandamide, I like it. But this is where it gets really mysterious, and this appears to be the junction between body and mind consciousness. Now I'll just try, and I can't articulate this very clearly because it's not clear to me, but the anandamide, as it's been described in electromicrographic studies and the like, is made out of the cell membrane when it's required. Now that's easy to say, but say for instance with thyroid hormone, I mean we know there's a classical feedback loop for thyroid. If you make thyroxine, which is the natural thyroid hormone, and the level goes up to an acceptable amount, you get a blocking chemical. It senses it in the brain, says that's enough, and it stops, and then it falls, and then it's a stimulating one, and it comes up and down. And it's very easy to conceptualise. But the anandamide is made from the cell membrane itself when required, right? And we have no idea of what intelligence at the level of a cell membrane can regulate its relationships to the cells immediately around it, right? I mean, I haven't made a good case of explaining that. That's because I don't understand it myself. But you can intuit that there is a link up now between the body and its own intelligence. Right? I mean, I feel rocks and trees have intelligence, and in fact they have more intelligence than most politicians that I've had the misfortune to talk to over time. But, yeah. Okay, industrial hemp is a practical strategy for a real paradigm shift. In the 1930s, this world transited from a carbohydrate-based economy to a hydrocarbon, and all the nightmares that have flowed from that, wars in the Middle East, pollution, all sorts of chemical contamination, right? Our motto there is overgrow the government, right? Now, I feel probably this year more confident than I've ever done before, because the Americans, remember, they banned recreational cannabis in the 30s, but then they legalised recreational cannabis, but they didn't legalise industrial hemp. Because the real reason that cannabis was banned was not the drug effect at all, it was to curtail the industrial use. The American activists, I mean, they took a lot longer than us to actually get the hemp crops in, but now with the industrial energy that that country has and the infrastructure that it has, it's grown from almost zero a year ago to now 60,000 hectares, right? And we're going to see some real competition with the big ugly oil sisters, right? Once hemp gets its roots in the ground, and we start tooling up the factories, we can have compounded timbers. We don't need to cut down trees. Paper, we don't need to cut down trees. Fabric, we don't need petrochemicals, right? So I feel, and I usually don't look to America for help, they've been nothing but obstruction, but now the genie's out of the bag, I think we can start to see some real progress in this area. All right. I mean, everyone knows how the carbon cycle works, the carbon and oxygen. It's, everything was nicely in balance with the trees and the animals until we started digging things up and putting them in factories and dramatically increasing the pollution across the board. Right, so overgrow the government and get on with it. I'll leave my last minute or two in case anyone has any questions. One closing point, last federal election, the hemp embassy in Nimbin actually asked me would I run for the Senate position there. And I mean, in the typical hemp embassy Nimbin sort of scenario, it was about 2 days before the close of the enrolment. So, yeah, so we ended up spending nothing on, we had nothing to spend on advertising, but we got 2.6% of the vote, right? So next time this clown election system comes, I mean, having one senator in the parliament won't change things, but I'll tell you what, it'll give us a microphone that we currently don't have. And I mean, if we do get there, that's what will happen. All right. Questions?